make sure we start that recording. Okay. All right, so here we are, meeting number 5. The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. So I'm going to slide on through. Our agenda is pretty simple today. Updates, by the way, steering committee has met. New resources were emailed out to you Friday evening or Saturday morning. Those are all in the Google Drive under the Meeting 5 Google Drive folder. Those are public comments. We should also have some other public comments coming to us by the end of the week, this week. We also, remember meeting 5 today, we're going to look at the 2 side by side, see if there's any additional final recommendations that we need to make, and possibly get into policy. Meeting 6 is policy, and celebrating that we made it all the way through 6 meetings to the end. Also, just wanted to let you know before I close out the slide deck, our next meeting is next week. There is not an off week before we meet again. Meeting number 6 is the 27th at 11:30 Central Time, 12:30 Eastern Time. All righty, so I'm going to stop sharing that one and pull up a full screen. All right. So this is, on your left-hand side, this is the recommendation list for meeting number 4. And here is the base. So one of the things that Janet did after last week's meeting, or 2 weeks ago, excuse me, she actually took some time on the back end after our meeting closed and really dug deeply into the Google Drive doc and made sure that those thoughts, ideas, recommendations were also included in the one that I sent the commissioner. So thank you very much for that additional work on your end. And so what we're going to do over here on the right-hand side is the actual draft framework. And I'm going to scroll down here, and right at the top of the document says base. And here is the base on our document for last week's meeting or before. And what we'll actually do is we'll go through this with a little fine-tooth comb and see if you feel as if what is here is represented over here in one way, shape, or form. Those things, of course, that are prioritized. Know that, of course, base, weights, direct funding, and outcomes are here, but there is a section down here that we've pulled everyone's attention to this week. It's just an additional consideration supported by subcommittees. So even if it's not up in the 4 components of the student-based funding formula, it may be represented in this section right here. So with that said, I'm going to zip it and hand it over to Janet if you're feeling all right, or we'll just open up the floor. Remember, these are in your Google Drive. If this isn't enough and you need to pull it down on your own and scroll through, they are in the Google Drive for the meeting number 5 folder. All right.
Thank you, Jamie. Does everyone have those so they can cross-reference them? And before we jump into this, it's my understanding the goals for today is the public comments up against what our final recommendations are. And I just want to make sure that before we jump deep into this document, because I want to spend our time on this today, are there any clarifying questions that anybody may have before we jump into comparing what the public comment draft went out, and then the notes from our meeting 4, because I did want to make sure I captured this committee's sentiments. Okay, then I think we just jump into it and start. You want to just start talking about the first category of base and compare to what our recommendations were and then what was in the draft. Any comments or clarifying questions that bubbles up?
Janet, I had one thing that I didn't see it in any of the documents on the draft, but I hope that the department or governor's office is considering something with inflationary costs. There's going to be cost of, like coordinated school health. We'd get X dollars for coordinated school health, and we've got that same amount for the past 10 years. Well, obviously, we've had a lot of increases in that time, and so there needs to be some consideration, inflationary factor in some of these components. I don't know where that goes, just kind of in the background, but it just needs to be considered.
Okay, let's put that in our notes under base.
And if I could,
go ahead. Who was that?
I'm sorry, it was me, Sean. I'm sorry.
That's okay, Sean. Go ahead.
Just to piggyback on what Eddie said and to add something, that we've received that same flat amount since the beginning of time. And when we're looking at doing weights for communities, a lot of times the health needs of students in concentrated poverty and other areas are much greater. So I think, we need to look at a formula-based model for coordinated school health too, where the needs are the greatest, and not just a flat amount. And I think the things that scare me too about the base, and I may have mentioned this, and I apologize for not being with the committee last time. I had to miss, and it was totally unavoidable, and I'm sorry. But the base, not knowing what the base looks like is kind of scary to me, because right now, we've made improvements to the base for teacher salaries over the last several years, but there are billboards in my county and neighboring counties where you can go and make more money starting out as a prison guard than you can as a school teacher and get a sign-on bonus. And so the base matters, because we're looking at these weights and the devil's in the details. If the base is not enough, the magnitude of the weights on all of these things, they really don't matter, or they don't have the magnitude of effect that we may want them to have. So emphasizing in our recommendations that the base include those inflationary costs, as Eddie mentioned, but also a fair and equitable formula for funding all positions has to be in the base in order for the weights to do what they're intended to do. And I don't know if I'm rambling or if that makes any sense, but we need to make sure that we're advocating for a larger piece of the pie and the base to be adequate funding, because we don't consider BEP to be adequate and equitable for all. So if we start with the same base, then we're starting out lower than we wanted to start and just layering on the weights, which again won't have the magnitude that I think intend for them to have. So anyway, that's my piece or soapbox on the base.
Thank you, Sean. I want to piggyback off of what you and Eddie both just said, because I appreciate the fact that because as a director of schools, this is what you live and breathe every day, and I feel like I have to step out. But I know Lily and Sean at the last meeting really was asking if we had enough included in the base, and here was my question, and maybe you all can help me understand it, or maybe it gets to what you and Eddie are alluding to, is how exactly does this list translate into a base number? Because it feels like it's examples rather than everything that it will cover. And so I guess my concern when I read this base, well, I see it as encouraging because we're really starting to look at all of these things collectively. We know we're not going to be cut, but what I'm not hearing is we don't have a dollar amount for the base. So how do we know if we're able to determine whether the base is enough to result in an overall increase for every district? That if we're not cutting anything, that's great. But I really feel like the conversations have led that the base needs to be higher for all, and that these are examples rather than everything that should be included. And I made some notes because I know it was early on. Things like curriculum and principles, I don't see in that list. Or Sean, I may be rambling too. Those were just my notes too, that while it's great we won't cut, does this base adequately give increased funds to everyone to do things like inflation or examples, because it's not exhaustive of a list, that cover things like principles and curriculum and competitive wages and all those things. I'm like you, maybe I'm just rambling, but those were my notes to make sure that the base just automatically was higher, not just that it was not less than, but that it was large enough, to your point, or the weights won't have the magnitude otherwise.
So I'm going to hop in here just for a moment and bring us back to one of the first meetings, and then was consistent in the slide deck from then on out was the desire to be and the recommendation that to be a flexible formula and to really provide a lot of flexibility at the local level. So you'll see that third bullet up from the bottom, the base is district specific needs, which are going to vary based on your unique needs at a local level. So yes, there have been questions about what all does that entail, but I do think that that's broad enough to at least help us think about the flexibility. And if there was a need for additional curriculum, or if there is a need for administrator staffing, whatever it happens to be, that there is room for LEAs to make those decisions. Do know that other districts, or I'm sorry, other subcommittees have actually already surfaced the question of what all does district specific needs entail, which then of course gets into some policy. Just wanted to let you know that I have jotted down here the concern about is the base adequate enough and is it equitable, and there needs to be consideration for inflationary costs. So emphasize fair and equitable formula to support salaries. Is there enough included? So if you'd like me to add anything else, just let me know.
I'm not sure which one raised their hand first. Norma, I'll go to you. I think your hand is up.
One thing that I think we can't ignore or forget is we're adding in a whole additional category here of public charter schools. So, I mean, that's been hammered home with us now that's going to happen. That's if we don't have enough and you water all of that down again, we're really going to be in a world of hurt. So if we don't fight for this on the front end, I'm afraid of, and be very specific, I'm afraid of what could happen on the back end when we're sharing the same piece of pie with lots more people.
Thank you, Norma. Lillian, your hand's up.
Yes, and I'm not, one of the things I'm going to say before I jump into what I wanted to say is, Norma, I'm not really sure, because I thought we were talking about the base, and I think the charter schools falls under the weights, and I think at our last meeting, Jamie explained or I heard it explained somewhere, probably when I was listening to another subcommittee. So I may have misunderstood what you said in that regard, and I want to make sure I understand it. But what I was going to, the comment I was going to make, and it does go back a little bit to what we talked about at the last meeting, and that is the fact that it's not an all-inclusive list of items that are that we think should be in the base. But when we talk about educator salaries, you know, we don't know, if we don't have the dollar amount, what does the formula for that look like? And for nurses, we've talked about it in our BEP review committee, and I only want to say this because nurses are in the base, but what does that mean? At the rate they were before, or what we would prefer it to be, which is at the national, the recommended ratio of nurses to students, and so on and so forth, with counselors and psychologists, etc. So I think we're grappling with this because we don't know what this really means, and several of you have articulated it as well. So I think we should have an asterisk, and of course this is not our document. This came out of the Commissioner and Governor's office. But it seems to me that under base, we should at least have an asterisk that links to the fact that it is not supposed to be less than what it is today, or it does include previously other items that were included in the previous formula, the BEP. I know we don't want to mention BEP very much, but something needs to be clarified so that we stop being concerned with what's not listed, because it is very broad and it's not very inclusive.
So a quick point of clarification, charter schools are not part of the base, currently part of the base. Charter schools can actually enroll public school students and get funding that way, but the reason it's down here in the weights, and it's a light funding here, is that it is for facilities and maintenance, because currently what happens is, you all probably already know, they do have to pay rent to school districts for use of those buildings. So it is more a facilities funding. Another point of clarification is this draft framework is for an entirely new formula. So funding for what is included in the BEP now is pulled to a new formula, either in the base or part of the weights. I hope that helps.
Eddie, get your hands up.
Yeah, that's just what I was going to say. I think it's earlier in the document, it mentions that if the funding was included in the current BEP, that it would also be included, you know, in the new formula. And kind of what Lily had said, this list is not exhaustive. It's just, I think some of the things that bubbled up to the top that said, this is maybe where we need additional funds in the new formula.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else on base from the group, and comparing from our meeting 4 and then the state draft? Okay, we'll move to weights. Any comments, observations on weights?
I'll bring it up because I brought it up at the last meeting about charter schools. I still don't quite understand the need for, I mean, if many of the students that are going to be enrolled in charter schools are also going to be receiving the additional weights in the poverty and concentrated poverty and the unique learning needs. So there's going to be additional weights there. And then to throw an additional weight on top of that for charter schools, I do worry about that. And I know I'm supposed to think positively about anything, but I worry about the potential. There's been bills to try to get, right now everything's nonprofit, but there have been bills for for-profit charter schools to allow that to happen. I worry about those organizations getting additional funds and then not putting that back in schools just so they can maximize their profit. And there's really no opportunity for the state to do anything, and somebody can ride off with additional funds that should have been going to students in schools. So I worry about having that weight in there and that being taken advantage of in the future.
Just to echo off of what Eddie said, I think we all, and again, presuming positive intent, but we all understand why that's in there. I don't think it makes sense, especially in a student-based funding formula, and supposedly the funding's following the students. I don't see why you would separate out a public charter school to get additional funds. And I understand the idea about facilities. Will then offer that through block grants outside of this formula if it's that important to the Tennessee General Assembly, but do not include it in our state funding formula.
This is Freddie. I agree with that, Jerry and Eddie, both on that. I do have a concern too in regard to the definition of rural. And I know we've gone over this in the committee, and it's a moderate weight, but it's an important weight because of the fringe and the distant and remote. And I don't, maybe I'm missing it, is scarcity addressed? I know Sean and I have talked about that and numerous times, but is scarcity addressed anywhere in here? Jamie, you know, as a part of your configuration as a district is what I'm trying to get at.
I am not aware of that, but I'll shoot that question up right now.
Okay, so I think scarcity, Sean, you might want to say something on that. I know we've discussed that in regard to that, because even though the NCES code may call us fringe, in actuality, we're probably pretty remote. And I think is the federal government the ultimate definer of what is rural, or is Tennessee the definer of rural? Thank you.
So sparsity is one of the policy considerations, not scarcity, but sparsity is for our policy on our new sheet, our new recommendation sheet.
Yeah, I think little bit I've read on it, and just some other conversations I've had, the considerations for sparsity would include the number of students per square mile in a district. So
I had done the same, Sean, but I just want to make sure I'm not seeing that in the draft proposal. And I know that not only myself, but others throughout the state have raised that issue on sparsity, and that needs to be in the formula.
Yeah.
So Fred, highlighted for you under rural right there, if you can look on the screen, it does say additional weight for small sparse LEAs under 3,000 students. Do you see that part?
I do. Thank you.
And I would just note, if I could, on that, I was reading that as well. I read that a few minutes ago. I have some concerns about that because of geographical area. Lauderdale County is a very large geographical county, much larger than some of our neighboring counties. And to put a cap on the number of students, I think you would need to look more at that definition of students per square mile for the county, because we bus students all over this large geographical county, and we're just over 3,000 students, about 3,500. But again, it would look much different in my county, than it would a smaller geographical county, I guess.
Sean, I've gone ahead and pulled up the recommendations form for today and highlighted sparsity since we're here. Yeah. So this is the current definition.
Okay, and I was just referring to what was noted in the recommendations document, or yeah.
So we are more than welcome to go ahead and hang here right now, or wait until later if there are if there's feedback on this definition.
Well, what I was going to say is I feel like we needed to put kind of a pin in that so that we get to starting to talk about policy. We really need to drill down on sparsity and definition of rural, because I made some notes on my too. Honestly, I think I've already said everything I had. I was trying to check off as Sean, as y'all were talking, but because I know under some of these definitions right now, some districts are serving both urban and rural. And I'm afraid if we use the NCS definition of rural, we're lumping too many in the same thing that so I definitely think we need to really drill down in that in the policy conversation. And we can jump over to that, or we can get through this but make sure we don't miss it when we get to policy, because it's a very critical point and it's been raised in every single committee meeting we've had. So I don't want to get that lost. So great points. Other conversation. I wanted to ask a question about weighting. What does it mean to be weighted heavily or moderate or light? I think that might end up being, that may be the same thing. It may end up in a policy conversation, but since we were on the weight screen, who makes that determination and what is that? Maybe I just don't understand, and Sean or
Yeah, I think
or somebody else understands it better than me.
no, I just want to say from a general thought, I mean, we're getting close to the end of our I guess engagement with this committee before we have in a few short weeks a framework. When do we get to come back and give our feedback on what is actually developed? I mean, will these committees obviously need to come back together and say, yeah, we see what you're saying here, but and we recommended this, but this is not what we got, and here's why we think this may need to look different and change. And I think we're thinking about, I'm jumping around, but we're thinking about talking about the weights right now. And to everyone's point on charter schools, I've heard it mentioned and published in places that that if this funding formula changes, that is in regard to charter schools, that Tennessee would lead the country in supporting students in this way. Well, let's make sure that we're leading the country and supporting all of the other students as well, because we haven't been in Tennessee. That's why we're having these conversations. For decades, we haven't been leading the nation and supporting all students. So before we start supporting charter schools and lead the nation in that, how about we fully fund and fully support all students in all public schools? That's just my take on it. And I know the camera's rolling and recording, so I wanted to make sure that I put that message out there as well.
I second that, Sean.
Thank you.
And Chairman Ayers, back to your question, I was going to ask the same thing. I'm not real clear on what heavy, moderate, and light weights mean. So I don't know if they've been defined somewhere that would help us understand, or maybe somebody else on this subcommittee understands it, has figured it out, but I don't understand it either.
I've surfaced the question and hopefully we'll get an answer.
Because I think there's other states that have been this before. I think there's some best practices already in weighting. This may capture that, but I'd like to know what that is.
I believe in some of the documents that were sent for this meeting, I think there were some examples of districts, states that had weighting and how they were weighted. I mean, it still doesn't go to the definition of what our state, and it also goes back to what we said, the weights really aren't as important as what that base is. You could have a huge weight, but if your base is $2,000, then it's really not going to be much. I also want to go back to what Janet had mentioned earlier about comparing this draft versus public comments. And I spent a little bit of time going over a lot of public comments, and there were many that I read were not in support of the weight for charter schools. So I just want to echo that that's just not a director of school saying that. That's coming from a lot of public comments, and I wanted to make sure that that's on record and that is shared with those that are in the steering committee.
Other comments on the weight category? These are great comments and questions, and want to be laser focused that the interest in representing this subcommittee, that we're getting it all at least stated and in writing of that rural perspective. And I think the reason the charter schools in that rural place doesn't come up, rural communities don't have charter schools really, for the most part. I'm trying to look at the next category I have when I look at meeting 4 after weight is direct funding. The only note that I made, and I think it might have been last meeting or meeting before that, I think that there needs to be some direct funding for data analyst, because I heard one committee member talk about that, and I didn't really see that captured anywhere else. And that just may be a leftover from a note, and it is captured, but I am trying to cross-reference what everybody says, so it doesn't get lost from one meeting to the next.
So Janet, is it the IT personnel specialist, this one right here?
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
I just didn't scroll down far enough.
Okay.
Thanks, Jamie.
Sure.
Other comments on direct funding? You want to move to outcomes? We had a fairly robust conversation last committee meeting about outcomes.
Yeah, Jan, I think you kind of started us off on this, that, the outcome should be an incentive-based outcome model versus a punitive type based. And I can't really tell in the draft if that's the way it's going to be or not going to be. I can't really tell.
Okay, we'll put that in our notes.
It does say per student bonus, so I assume that based on that, then it would not be a punitive type outcome.
And I do think we talked about that growth should be a measure rather than absolute achievement when we're awarding funding, just because we're dealing with a population we're trying to course correct economic status. So I don't want the expectations to be less, but at the same time, I think growth is more of a measure than this is where I'm not saying that well. Somebody said it better at the last committee meeting than I'm regurgitating it, but I'm not seeing it necessarily.
We have always been a state that looks at both achievement and growth or
Yes.
value added. We have that data going back to 1990. And it can't be left on the table and us go strictly with an achievement measure and be calling ourselves closing gaps. We have to keep the growth in there in order for our students to know how they're winning. There are wins that are happening.
Agree. Thank you, Norma. You said that so much better than me.
I'll also reiterate what Norma said. As many people may not like it, but our accountability model does a pretty good job of including achievement. It includes value added growth. It includes growth over time. It includes subgroups. It really hits everything that you're looking at when you talk about, outcomes and making sure your district is doing a good job. It allows you many opportunities to showcase that. So, some people may not like it, but I think it does a pretty good job of capturing that.
Any other comments on like the cross between our meeting 4 and then the draft that went out for public review and comment? Jamie, just as a side note, and have other committees, do you have some list if there were experts that needed help guide us on like policy conversations or definitions as we prepare for meeting 6? We've really not brought in that outside expert. And I know we've talked about bringing our own expertise to the table. Is there anyone in that rural space or anyone that you recommend if we need it? Some, maybe not even for them to be at the committee, but a resource that we can use because we only have a week between now and meeting 6.
Some committees asked for experts a while back, particularly on the fiscal end, and all those visitors, those experts do have to be vetted prior to attending a subcommittee meeting. So I'm more than happy to surface a need for us looking for an expert in the rural arena. If you'd like me to. I'm not so sure about the turnaround time between now and next week, but.
And it may not be practical, but because I think if we're okay with this section, I think we now can turn our attention to policy discussion and really drill down and start talking about some of these definitions, because I think that's where we were going anyway. Is everybody comfortable with that? Okay.
Janet, I wondered if we could consider Alan Pratt kind of a rural expert, since he is kind of leads that for the country with a rural collaborative.
Well, yeah.
He has worked across the nation with states and has been working in this space. So I don't know if there are things that maybe Alan might have. Alan, I know I'm putting you on the spot, but I've done that before. So you should be accustomed.
I think that's excellent. And I mean, he's been informing our group. I mean, Jamie, is there a process that we can do to vet Alan with some of this policy discussion in particular? The reason I say that is when we get into policy and this legislation goes in place, I want to make sure when we're really trying to define what these definitions are in policy as it relates to Tennessee/rural, I'd like to make sure that it's not just this group's voice, but that we have an expert voice with guiding that conversation or helping make that recommendation in meeting 6 stronger.
Sure. So, I think it behooves the group greatly that we already have Alan with us. So part of us being a subcommittee member is sharing your level of expertise. And so I think that's already a given. If there is anything additional or outside of our meeting time, that's where we would need to request any other type of, thumbs up.
Okay.
Did that answer that question?
I think so.
So as a subcommittee member, what you bring to the table is your level of expertise. So sharing it is not only welcome, but encouraged. Yep.
Okay. Do y'all want to move to policy discussion? And Alan, we're going to.
Yeah.
You're going to be our resident expert on this committee to help us with this too.
First of all, thanks, Norma. Second of all, I've kind of kept quiet on purpose because some of the funding pieces is really directed to superintendents, and that's why I kind of just listened and kind of took time. But I did email Jamie, I think last week, right, Jamie? Is that right? Yeah, about the piece on the. I feel strongly that we don't need to stick with the NCES definitions. And I think part of that reason was brought up earlier in the call about this sparsity, but population, but also just location to certain areas. And I'll give you one quick example. Anybody ever been to Whitwell, Tennessee? It has one red light. It is less than 20-something miles from Chattanooga, so it's really not considered on grant purposes a rural area. It has one red light, does not have a Dollar General, so that's enough explanation, all you need right there. If that place is not rural considered by the federal government, then we don't need to use federal government definition for rural. I think there's 41 different agencies in the federal government that has definitions of rural. I don't like any of the 41, to be honest with you. So I think looking at it from a sense of what our state or what the committee could come up with, this is our job as a committee. I'm not saying it's going to be easy and could be done in 1 week. It can be, give you a good reference point, but I do think that's something we need to, seriously think about moving forward and adding the components. And then looking at it, does it matter with school size? Does it matter with certain things that are going to be a big impact on what the schools are looking through or looking for? So that's my take. Happy to answer questions. Also, I think I shared with Jamie, Colorado is really one of the few states that kind of defined rural, and they did it 2 or 3 years ago, and they have it on their website. That's one thing we can look at. It's not going to match perfectly, but I think it's something we can definitely dig into and go from there.
Thank you, Alan. That's helpful.
Hey, Alan, use Woodbury as an example for me next time. We've got 3 red lights, but we do have a Dollar General, so.
Well, you would be considered suburban then.
Urban fringe. I can take
there you go.
Sugar Mountain and some of the other areas around Wilmouth Creek and say, okay, where's the skyscrapers at?
I think you're right on looking at the areas of the state, but I do like the USDA's rurality kind of index and how they're looking at it. It's a little bit different, but it does have a better opportunity in some cases for districts to qualify or areas to qualify. The other aspect I think is how, and I don't know if we want to go this deep or not, but you're looking at it from the sense of, are we going to look at anything on SAPE data on poverty levels and rural as the federal government does with Title I definitions or Title I qualifications? So those things, the things that might be come into play as well.
Very helpful conversation to capture in this policy piece. I'm looking at our subcommittee, the policy reflections and feedback. And so I'm looking down through here of, are any of these jumping out at you? I think one of the policy things that we did talk about was weight strengths. A definition of that, and I'm not really seeing.
Janet, can you say that one more time? I'm sorry.
Weight, the weighting strengths of,
yeah, I think that one in the question set.
Okay.
So one of the approaches that other subcommittees have taken this week is on the left-hand side in that column, you see for example, the definition of ED, and the steering committee feedback is the current definition is direct cert. And do you agree, disagree, or see a combo of some sort with that definition? And right underneath is where I'll add any of your commentary.
Okay. So we'll just take these in order because I don't want to miss anything. Any comments on economically disadvantaged?
I think there's some disparity there. I'd like to be noted of my comment here. I think there's some disparity because free and reduced lunch forms that are filled out and because of situational changes in families, when they do those free and reduced lunch forms, it's not taking advantage in the funding formula, in the physical capacity or the funding, it is not taking advantage of. I verified that this week. And that does need to be addressed because those that fill out those lunch forms, I think, should be as fully counted as direct cert. Now, there's others that might disagree with that, but I think that's a piece there, particularly on when there is situational poverty that would exist because of layoffs or that sort of thing, or economic downturn.
That makes a lot of sense, Freddie.
I want to echo that. That's a good point. I mean, we all experience the difference between direct cert and our free and reduced lunch rates. And going to Alan's point too, just like rurality, different federal agencies seem to have different definitions. And that's also kind of shows up in this discussion, where direct cert is not necessarily utilized by all the states for these kinds of policy decisions, whereas free and reduced lunch is maybe utilized more, better reflect the school and local community.
Yeah, originally the state used free and reduced as a determination for economically disadvantaged, and we received extra money for that. Then they changed it to direct certification, and the justification was, well, it was a net neutral difference. So it might have been that 1 year, but over time we've seen a significant drop in the amount of money we receive in our in that factor there. So that's why these definitions are very important, because if they change those definitions, it can really impact what we get on this funding formula.
Agree.
Eddie, when did that, do you have any idea when that changed, or when you're talking about there, when that occurred? I've done a little research,
Yeah.
but I've not done a whole lot, found that when that change took place.
Well, 2011 was my first year as director, and I think it happened after I was director, so probably within the first couple of years of that. So maybe I would think before, 2012, 13, somewhere around in there, maybe. I'm not 100% sure though.
Yeah, I became director in 17, and it was already in place then, so.
That's correct. It happened while I was at the State Department. It was either 13 or 14. And just to give you an example, and everybody's got their own numbers, but how it impacted us in the district I serve now, we were 63% free and reduced lunch, and we're 18% direct cert.
Yeah, I've experienced the same thing here at Norma, so thank you for that. So I think that disparity issue is a major area of being addressed in the draft formula. Thank y'all.
Thank you. Great conversation. And this will really help us inform us, because we really drilled down on this in meeting 6. And I just feel like it's critically important to get this correct. So this is kind of a precursor, and I think we can take what this is and really do our homework between now and next week to add some substance to these conversations. The next one is definition of concentration of poverty.
This is Mike. I would prefer if we could add some language that says attending a Title I eligible school, because I know I have some schools that are eligible for Title I that I haven't made Title I because they get the same amount of money and I just have to spread it out farther. So I think that would be more beneficial.
Let me ask a question, because I've been trying to cross-check a lot of things, and my numbers may be wrong, and I need the directors of schools or somebody to fact check me or Alan. It's my understanding about 80–90% of the elementary schools in Tennessee are Title I. If that's the case, and this is the definition, does this concentration of poverty really get at what we want if we use Title I as that definition for concentration of poverty only?
I believe if you go back and look at the numbers, if you consider this, I think it accounts for over half of the students in Tennessee, if you use this as a definition.
I mean, will that do what we need to do for these rural communities by that definition? I don't know. That was my only question in this one. And this is where I have to lean on you all. I don't know what that is, how that's interpreted in the field.
Both of my high schools are eligible. They aren't Title I, but they are eligible.
And would you go with a school-wide program with those? I don't know if are there even any targeted assisted left? Because you have two different kinds of schools under Title I. You can have the school-wide program or the targeted assisted, but at the same time, you're still serving the children. The number of children served is based on the same kind of formula. And it's been beneficial for sure. And Mike, that may be something that everybody who's in that boat may want to get eligible.
Ms. Ayers, to answer your question, I think if the weights are stackable, meaning we get the concentrated poverty and the rural, I think that answer to that question would be yes. But if they're not stackable, then I don't know that would be adequate.
Folks, I just don't want to bother you, but I've got to slip out. I enjoyed the conversation. I have full confidence that you all are going to rock it.
Thank you, Eddie. And I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. We're about 3 minutes away. I know a big part of what we're concentrating on in meeting 6 is policies and these definitions. So we can take a little bit more time, but I think our meeting today was about making sure that our recommendations and the public feedback that we were capturing them in our notes, and then we really start drilling down and getting ready for the policy discussion for meeting 6. So I don't want to cut us off short because the dialogue is great, but I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. Sean, your hand's up. I think you're on mute, Sean.
Sorry, I hit the button, but it didn't come off there. Thank you. I know we're short on time, but I don't think that I can leave this meeting without saying something and just making sure that it's, because I think it may be relative to a policy conversation, but nowhere in the funding discussion and moving forward, whatever you call the new formula or whatever we move to next year and beyond, I would ask my colleagues if you agree or disagree for the record, if you agree with me, but nowhere should we ever allow public funds to be diverted to private schools in the form of ESAs or vouchers or whatever you want to call them, without those schools also carrying the same level of accountability that teachers, administrators, schools, and districts carry for the same public funding. So I just want to say that, and if I hate to put it, I'm not putting it for a vote, but if we can get a consensus that this committee, or at least the majority of the members of this committee, agree that public funds should never be funneled to private education without the same accountability that public funds are scrutinized under currently in Tennessee.
Brady, your hand is up.
I second that motion, and I would also like to add, Sean, that standards, that utilizing of Tennessee standards should also be in that conversation or in that motion, is not only accountability, but any of that would be utilizing Tennessee standards that have been adopted by the State Board of Education.
Thank you.
And I want to add some, thank you, Norma. I want to add something to this because I had seen it in draft 4. It's in the notes, but I do think it needs to get added to our policy conversation for meeting 6 and I know it came out of the legislative subcommittee too, that just happened, but in tandem to this funding formula to address the fiscal local capacity, because that is a policy consideration that does not need to get missed in this conversation. And I'm just trying to make sure I check all the boxes that you all bring up.
Thank you. That was on my checklist too.
Okay, I thought it might be, Sean, so I just wanted to make sure.
It's critically important. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Janet, say it one more time. I was typing and couldn't keep up with you.
to address the fiscal local capacity. I believe the legislative subcommittee has brought this up too, but it needs to be reviewed in tandem with this change in funding formula. And Sean, you may be able to say that better than me.
No, you perfect, spot on there. And one other thing, if I know we're jumping around, but we're running out of time. And I was trying, but I think I don't know that we've talked about this or I've seen it anywhere, but like in moving forward, we're doing something transformational for the state of Tennessee, and our funding formula hasn't changed, largely changed in decades. We all know the history of that. But somewhere in our policy, we should have a regular review process of professionals, across the state, like we have with subcommittees, on maybe not yearly, but every 3 years or some kind of cadence to review and make sure that our state funding formula is adequate and equitable. And so having a consistent review process of this and moving forward, because once we get this in place, if it doesn't work, we don't need to wait 10 years to make some change.
30.
Or 30. Yeah, exactly.
Great points. Again, I don't want to rush anyone. I think we've got from this list of policy reflections and feedback, our questions and concerns. I'm assuming, Jamie, that what you're typing is what I'm going to have to sign off on, correct?
Absolutely.
So I want everybody to take a chance to look at that to make sure that this is what gets submitted before I sign off on it. And then for us between now and next week to really go into our Google Docs and add some content to other things we haven't addressed that hits the policy category, the ones that are listed here, because it's helpful. Our deep notes, I do think, are helpful. So in looking at what Jamie typed, I'm going to give you all a minute to make sure that this adequately covers what you want me to sign off on today for Jamie to send to the commissioner.
And right before we hop into just review of this, know that in the Google Drive, this document, I'll put this document as a PDF into meeting number 5. And all of these, there's only one more about a definition, and the rest of them have guiding questions for the group to consider when we meet for meeting 6. We also have some blanks here at the bottom if there are things in policy that come up that are not addressed in any of these here above. So know that they are there, review them, make some notes, and you can come ready to chat through those. So I'm going to go back up here to the top. Evidently can't type today. Is it not Friday yet?
Nope.
Not yet. Just make sure everything from today was captured. Unmute and tell me if there's anything in addition to.
Are you all see anything in the base weight or direct funding? Is that captured today? Outcomes?
I'm sorry, but you may want to go back to weights. I'm not sure that the third bullet terminology is reflective of what we intend there. I think it was Eddie that said in having a weight for charters, not in favor of having a weight for charters. I know it's the weight category, but it sounds like we're just blanketly saying we're not in favor of charters. And that may be true, but that's not what you're trying to say here.
You're right. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you.
Good catch, Lily.
Yep.
Anything else in base, weight, or direct funding?
Okay, here is the question list. Question list, and actually the first 2 policy discussions. And of course, we can add to these even next week.
And I'm wondering if above the questions, the first one, base, if we need to clarify what we mean by how does this translate into a number. The reason I'm saying that is I did listen to the presentation that Commissioner made to the steering committee and to other groups. I think even the subcommittee chairs, and also to the district updates in study council. She said, I'm not going to get out in front of the governor. We don't know what the numbers are. We don't know what would be assigned to any of these. And so I know we want more clarity on the base, but is it really asking about the dollar amount? Because that's not going to be provided now. And she said she's waiting. The governor in the state would certainly be talking about his budget, but we cannot apply a number at this juncture. So does that change what we should put here under base?
I wonder if it should translate into numbers much. How does this translate into, is it an overall increase to the base?
I think something along those lines would be more practical or more in keeping with what I think the group really wants to know. But that's my thought.
Again, a really good catch, Lillian.
And again, of course, directors, I think we all look to you. Does this translate to what you think it should say?
I think so, but I think in there too, we're just fearful of the list is so broad. You know, will it include everything that's currently there plus some additional positions? Because I think back to my point earlier in the conversation, you know, it was, we don't know what the base looks like. So will the base be similar to what it was before, where we feel like that, you know, a school of 650 students should generate more than a principal and a half-time assistant principal? Will it, you know, what will the base include? Will it include an increase in the number of funded positions or the total dollar amount? You know, I think, I guess, you know, we're needing or wanting a more exhaustive list of what it will include, just for some reassurance, I guess.
Right.
Okay. Other comments or insight or changes to the questions, concerns, clarifications list?
I guess, Jamie, if you could add there, will it at least include the funding for positions as it currently exists, or will there be an expected increase to that with the new formula? I don't know if that makes sense.
And I think that should be exist instead of exits.
Okay.
I'm impressed you can type that fast, Jamie.
Well, it does make for some typos.
Other comments? Okay. Policy reflections and feedback. I think we got really to the first two. And Alan, I think you'll be very helpful with this as well. Not that everybody on this committee will. I think Alan may have already gone off since we're past our time.
So I'm going to PDF this, put it in the Google Drive folder for meeting 5. I'm sure it will go over to meeting 6 later. I will do that as soon as I email this to Janet in just a moment. She will sign off with her check of approval. And then we will see one another next week, next Thursday, the 27th, same time, same back channel. 11:30 Central Time, 12:30 Eastern Time.
Sean, thank you for your Google Docs. Let's really work on these policy and definitions. And y'all, thank you. This is a heavy lift, and your participation is critically important, and it's valued. So thank you.
Appreciate you all. Stay warm.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, you all. Great work. Bye-bye.
Have a great weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.